let us start. We're dealing with the cortex and the subcortical structures today. This is your basic anatomy, and as I said before, the reason we start with anatomy is because everything after that refers back to the anatomy. So if you can get a good sense of the anatomy from the beginning, it's really a very good idea. And also, if you can't fully get to grips with it right now, take heart. As you go through the tutorials and as you learn the other material, it reinforces the knowledge about neuroanatomy. So just bear that in mind. Also, just a tip, on the website, on the Neuropsychology SA website, as I've mentioned before, have a look under articles. You'll see there are 2 articles that are about Latin and Greek roots of medical terms that we use in neuropsychology. I recommend you print that out and just keep it next to you when you're studying, because it will help you make sense of the words. If you know, for example, hemo refers to blood, then you know what a hematoma is and a hemorrhage and that type of thing. Okay. All right. Now, one of the things that we're not normally used to as neuropsychologists is the directions that are used in the textbooks. Dorsal, lateral, ventral, medial, anterior, posterior. And I want to explain this to you quickly. If you think of the way an animal stands, okay? But let's not use an animal, let's use a human, let's use a human baby. Dorsal is the back, ventral is the stomach. Now, if you imagine a baby like this, with its head up, then dorsal is the top, ventral is in the bottom. So when you look at the spine, the spinal cord, dorsal is there, ventral is here. When you're looking at the head, dorsal is here, ventral is here. Okay. Anterior and posterior is fairly easy. But sometimes the word rostral is used instead of anterior, and sometimes caudal is used instead of posterior. So just bear that in mind. Caudal, meaning coming from has to do with the Latin word for tail, like a horse. So if you think caudal, it's at the back. Right, rostral is the front. And then you have dorsal, you have ventral, but it's also referred to superior and inferior. So top of the brain superior, bottom of the brain inferior. Now the reason I'm explaining this is because it can get quite confusing, especially with the dorsal and the ventral. You know, how can dorsal be here, but dorsal be here? You know, so bear in mind that little picture. Okay. So this is just to illustrate further. Just want to conclude my. This is a section of the. Oh yeah, sorry. There we go. Thanks. This is a picture of the spinal cord. This in the middle here, it looks almost like an H shape, is the gray matter. The white matter is around it. And the top here is dorsal, so that would be the part that's back of your spine, and this would be the ventral, which is more the front. And when you get it, when you study it in the textbook, it becomes very important because you have dorsal roots and ventral roots, and some of them are ascending and some of them are descending. And we'll speak a bit more about that in a moment. Just another tip, dorsum means back and ventrum means stomach, also just to help you remember that. Now, grey and white matter, we all know that grey matter, well I hope you know, maybe you don't. You know that little neuron is made of the little axon and then the cell body. Now the axon is covered by a myelin sheath. The myelin only develops when a child is born. Those little axons aren't fully myelinated. That is a process that happens over the first 21 years of one's life. But the axons generally have some myelin on, and they are whitish in appearance. And so when they are grouped together, we call it white matter, and it has a white appearance. Whereas the other parts form the grey matter that you see. Now I know when I started studying neuropsychology, I always assumed you only get grey matter on the outside and white matter on the inside, but you get many grey matter structures on the inside. And this is now a slice a coronal slice this way, showing some of the gray matter on the inside of the brain. And I've put this other picture here so that you know what you're looking at. So for example, this yellow part here is that there, and that's the thalamus. Down here is the hypothalamus. Okay. Here we have the basal ganglia, also those parts of the globus pallidus, basal ganglia, globus pallidus. Okay. And of course, it's very similar on the left and the right. Okay. Something you also need to know and need to understand is that we have some very important white matter tracts in the brain. And you need to know where they are, because as those white matter tracts are interrupted, it affects a person's behavior, and it affects what you're going to see on what you're testing. So for example, there's a very strong tract between the frontal lobes and the cerebellum. So if the cerebellum is injured, you're going to get frontal lobe behavior. And if you're testing somebody, you mustn't then just test the frontal lobe, because you're going to make assumptions that there's something wrong with the frontal lobe when there's actually something wrong with the cerebellum. And so if you understand what these tracts are, then you know what else to look for, what else to test. Now here are some of the well-known tracts. This is the superior longitudinal fasciculus, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, and the uncinate fasciculus, which goes across like that from the one hemisphere to the other. Just looking at in a brain scan, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but again, you can see the various important tracts. Here's your uncinate fasciculus from one hemisphere to the other. This is your cingulum. Your cingulum, as you might know, is just above the corpus callosum. If I had to show you in my brain, if you had to open up the brain like this, you know that the corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. Okay. The cingulum is a gyrus just above the corpus callosum. Okay. And it's a very, very important white matter tract, and it's a very important part of our limbic system. And we'll speak more about the limbic system later too. Again, just another illustration of the various white matter tracts. Now you get white matter or neural connections between hemispheres, but also within hemispheres. As you can see here, these are within hemispheres. And you get, for example, the corpus callosum that crosses hemispheres. Something else you need to know about the little neurons is every now and again in the book you hear what is referred to as a ganglia or a ganglion. And it's a structure containing a number of nerve cell bodies, typically linked by synapses and often forming a swelling on a nerve fiber. Now, nerve fiber is really also a whole lot of neurons, axons together, okay? But every now and again, you'll get areas where they synapse. And if you get a whole lot of neurons synapsing in a certain area, it will bulge out a bit, and that's called a ganglion. Here's an illustration. So this is in your spinal cord. This is the one side of it. You've got the dorsal horn there, the ventral horn there. And you can see these little neurons that synapse over here, forming a bulge, which is your ganglion. Now, another word that you're going to come across quite a lot is a nucleus or nuclei. And this is a group of cells that form a cluster that can be identified histologically. This picture here, what we're looking at here is the brain stem. And within the brain stem, there are very, very many different nuclei. Because if you think about all the tracts that are running, all the nerves and so on running from your legs, from your arms, from the periphery, it all gets tracked through the brain stem. And a lot of them form nuclei there before going through to the brain. Now, within our brain stem, we have a number of cranial nerves, well, there are 12 of them, and they enter into the brain stem and exit the brain stem at various points. It's very complicated. You don't need to know exactly where they enter and exit. But you do need to know what the cranial nerves are for. Now, These are them. The first one, for example, is the olfactory nerve with the optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. Now, some of them are fairly obvious, like the olfactory nerve. You know it has to do with olfaction, you know it has to do with nose, it has to do with smell. But you need to know that the olfactory nerve is the first cranial nerve. So the way to remember it, if you Google it, there are lots of different mnemonic techniques to try and remember which nerve comes first, which cranial nerve. I quite like this one. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So if you use these letters to make up that little sentence, then you're going to remember the order of these cranial nerves. Now, just to show you, and this is a picture I'm just going to go over quickly, but when you are studying, you'll see there are very good pictures in your textbook as well. But you can also have a look at this one, because this explains, it's now looking at the brain from the bottom, okay? So you've got it turned upside down like this. Got your cerebellum over here, and then this here is your brain stem that's sticking up like this, okay? And on the cerebellum, you have these many different cranial nerves. You're welcome to come and look at this afterwards. Sorry, I just want to try and put it back together. So even here on this little brain model, you will see the different cranial nerves coming out of the brain stem. What you do need to know, while you don't need to know exactly where each one goes into the brain stem, because that is really very complex, what you do need to know is just more or less where they are. So for example, the optic nerve, you must know it's by the optic chiasm. This is the optic chiasm there. Your olfactory bulbs come out there just under the frontal lobes. Here are your olfactory bulbs. You just need to have a sense of where they are. Now I'm going to run through the cranial nerves because we have a lot to cover today. And I think the most important about the cranial nerves is you need to know what number the nerve is. Is it the first or the second or the 12th? What is the name of it? And basically what it does, and then more or less where it is. Okay. Olfactory nerve, as I mentioned, is underneath the frontal lobes there. It is responsible for smell. And if you've got a patient and you're suspecting they've had damage to their olfactory bulbs or to their olfactory nerve, you simply ask them how is your sense of smell. You can, of course, also test it, and often neurologists test it, and neuropsychologists also often test it. They'll have little bottles of, you'll have one with vinegar, one with coffee, one with ammonia, some with ammonia, like Handy Andy. Now, the interesting thing about the cranial nerve is even if the cranial nerves are no longer functioning, a person can still smell ammonia. So it's interesting to include that in your test. And you really, and of course, if you're giving them little bottles of something to smell, they mustn't be able to see the contents of the bottles, and they mustn't be able to hear it either. So if you've got instant coffee, it mustn't rattle. You must be careful how you hold it, and then just let them smell it. Second cranial nerve is the optic nerve, and I know this is a bit of a gruesome picture, but one needs to get an understanding of it. So if you had to remove the eye, this little optic nerve is right behind it, and it goes into the optic chiasm, and you'll be learning in depth about the visual pathways, so I'm not going to go into that right now. It's obviously responsible for vision, and you can just observe your patient if you're busy assessing them and you can see they're not seeing well. That's a clue for you, and if they keep turning their head to see better, then you need to ask, how is your vision? Are you ever having any difficulties with your vision? Now, this is just an illustration of the optic nerve that goes into the optic chiasm over there. Okay. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor, also behind the eye. It's that little one there. It is involved with reaction to light, with the lateral movements of the eyes, side to side, the movement of the eyelids, the deviation of the eye outwards. And when there's a problem with that, then a patient will have double vision. They might have large or irregular pupils, so you need to look into the eyes. If you're seeing irregular pupils, you need to wonder why that might be the case. And they might have a drooping eyelid, if that is the case. The trochlear nerve, that little one there. I know these are all quite similar to each other, and I'm going to recommend a certain app that you can use to look at this anatomy very carefully. It's also an app that I'm going to show you a little bit later today, because this app allows you to highlight certain parts of the brain and remove it so that you can see what is behind it, or to just follow where it is, and allows you to turn the brain so you can see how it looks from the top, from the bottom to the side, and it also labels it for you. So it's a very handy tool. Now, the trochlear nerve is responsible for the upward and downward of eye movements. And this is something that's normally tested by a neurologist. You know, this is why they say, you know, follow the light, or not the light, follow my finger, up, down, side, side. That is not something we normally do. The fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve. It is the one over there. And it is responsible for chewing, and this is also assessed by a neurologist, not something we really deal with. The abducens nerve, that little one over there, again in the orbit, it's responsible for the lateral movements of the eyes, again assessed by a neurologist. And then you get your facial nerves, these blue ones spreading out throughout here. They're responsible for facial movements and expressions. So you'll often see if somebody's had a stroke, the one side of the face is limp, while there'll still be facial expression on the other side of the face, and it's because of a facial nerve that has been affected. And you notice it by just looking at facial asymmetry. If somebody's smiling at you and it's lopsided, you know, there's one side of a smile, not the other side, then you can suspect that. Your auditory vestibular nerve is the one that goes from where your ear is through all the little canals and things. It is responsible for hearing. If you later, because you're going to be looking at depth about how hearing works and how the cochlea works and so on, and this is really just an extension of that into the brain. And sometimes, you know, we as psychologists can't really test hearing. They really need to go to an audiologist for that. But if you find yourself speaking loudly to the person, you know that they probably have a hearing problem, or if you have to keep repeating yourself, and you can, of course, ask the person, you know, do you struggle with hearing? Are you hard of hearing? The glossopharyngeal nerve, coming down there, this blue one, responsible for the tongue and the pharynx. And there you can ask about the loss of taste. You know, does food taste the same? Can you taste food, especially over the back third of the tongue? 10th cranial nerve is the vagus nerve. There we go. Responsible for heart, blood vessels, viscera, movement of the larynx and the pharynx. So now you look at more bodily things. And if a person is hoarse, then you should ask about that. The spinal accessory nerve coming through here controls neck muscles and viscera, and weakened rotation of the neck and inability to shrug will give you a sense that there's something wrong there. Hypoglossal nerve, you can see the blue over there. Tongue muscles, and if there's a problem with that nerve, then you'll have wasting of the tongue with deviation to the side of the lesion on protrusion. So the person puts their tongue out. If it goes to one side, it is on the side of the lesion. All right, I've put this slide in, not that you need to know this, but just to illustrate how very complex all these little cranial nerves are, about where they come in and where they meet and cross over and so on. Now, of course, we're just still talking about nerves. You have afferent and efferent ones, and one way you can remember it is an afferent connection arrives to the brain, and an efferent connection exits the brain. So you know all your sensory information is going to the brain, so it's afferent, and all the messages from the brain to the rest of your body and your muscles to move is your efferent. Now, the left hemisphere communicates to the right hemisphere. We know that it does that through the corpus callosum, but it doesn't only do that through the corpus callosum. In this picture here, you can see the corpus callosum over here. Towards the front of the brain, there's a little part called the anterior commissure. And you'll see it in your textbooks. There will be better diagrams than this one. Most of the neurons involved in the frontal lobes, they tend to cross through the anterior commissure. So it's also a very dense little pathway, a little bridge that crosses there. All right. Now, I know I'm going through this quite quickly, but as we have quite a lot to cover. Now you know the cortex. You know you've got the parietal, occipital, and temporal and frontal lobes. When you're busy studying the cortex, ask yourself, what area is this? What am I looking at? Exactly where is it? By which gyri, by which sulcus? What divides it? What is it called? And what happens if it's damaged? Because if you can learn in that way, then you're going to be able to answer the exams for the questions for the second exam. And then what I would like you to do in addition to that is ask yourself, how am I going to test this? Because ultimately that's what we do as neuropsychologists. We need to figure out how we're going to test if this area is damaged or not. Looking through this very quickly, and I know this sounds funny, but when I started studying neuropsychology, I didn't realize that people's brains have a very, very similar appearance. They are different for every person, but there's generally a very, very similar appearance. For example, all normal brains will have 3 gyri here. You have the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. All of them will have an angular gyrus. All of them will have a supramarginal gyrus. Exactly the size and the shape of it differs depending on what the person has been doing, what their genetics were like, but we all have those. We all have a central sulcus with a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus. We all have a lateral occipital gyrus. And the frontal lobe is a little bit less easy to see, but you have a superior frontal gyrus, a middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So the frontal lobes are a little bit less easily defined, whereas if you look at the brain, the central sulcus is very clear, and you know the gyrus before that is a precentral, the one after it is a postcentral. And it becomes very important when you're looking at brain scans, when you're looking at just knowing where the damage is to a brain. Now Brodmann, you've heard of Brodmann's areas, I'm sure. Brodmann was took a lot of time, and he studied the brain, the levels of the cortex, because each cortex is made up of different levels, and he took different sections out of different areas of the brain, and he examined the layers of the cortex, and he found that the different areas had different structures in the layers of the cortex, and then he named them after that. And what research has found is that this is very significant because a lot of these areas have very specific functions. Not all of them, but a lot of them. For example, this area here, which we all know as Broca's area, 44. Okay. 17 is your primary visual area, and we're going to be talking a bit more about that. And you need to know some of the basic numbers of the Brodmann areas. You need to know numbers of the more important areas. Okay. Let's look at the occipital lobes. Information comes in through the eyes. Okay, this is the anterior of the brain, this is posterior of the brain. So this is the front, this is the back. So as you all know, information comes in through your eyes, it goes to the back of the brain, it goes to what we call V1. And you need to know it's called V1, the primary visual cortex. That information, they get sent via neurons to the second level processing, which is V2. It then gets sent out even further. And every time it gets sent out further, it gets more specialized and more analyzed. So V3 is now looking at dynamic form, or the shapes of objects in motion. If you see a car going past, the part of your brain that is registering it is that shape and it's moving away from you, is that V3 area. Now the V4 is the part of your brain that recognizes colors. This is pink, this is gray, this is green. So the information that comes from here and goes there is the one that is recognizing colors. And then motion I'll show you in a moment. Oops, sorry. All right. This is just another picture. So you can see light comes in through the eyes. It goes through the whole process, through the optic chiasm, right to the back here by V1, goes on to V2, goes on to V3. V3A is motion. This area is more form. V5 is this little area over here, which is motion. So a person has damage in that area for some reason. They can't see things moving. They can identify something, they know what it is, but they can't see that it's moving. It's here, and then it's there. They actually don't see the flow of movement. I had a question, do we need to know the illustrations? If somebody had to show you a picture like this, you need to know where V1, V2, V3, V4, V5 is. Now, the visual pathways, I'm not going to dwell on this too much because it is very complicated. It's one of those things that you have to sit and you have to go over it and over it and over it and draw it for yourself over and over and over until you understand it. Because you have the, for example, the information on the left visual field goes to two parts. It goes to that side of the eye and then that side of the eye. And then from there it goes here and it crosses over to the right side of the brain, whereas this one comes and it stays ipsilateral, meaning stays on the same side to the right side of the brain. And what ultimately happens is this information gets projected into the right side of the brain. So, and that is why your left visual field you will see in the right side of your brain. But it's more complex than that, and so it takes some time with that. What you do need to know is what the different what you also need to know, because you need to know those visual pathways. What you also need to know is if somebody has damage to those visual pathways in one of those places, what will the result be? So you're going to be learning about monocular blindness, which is where one eye stops working completely and you can only see through the other eye. Bitemporal hemianopia, bi meaning two, temporal meaning, if you think on the temporal sides, hemi means half or half, and anopia means that you can't see. Okay, so you can't see on the right-hand side. Well, this one's on the right-hand side, that one's on the left-hand side, because it's on the temporal sides. Right hemianopia is on the right-hand side, the right field, you can't see. Right nasal hemianopia means that you can see fully with the left eye, but with the right eye, there's that first half on the nasal side that you can't see. Quadrant anopia, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Then you also have problems with scotoma, where there's an area in your field of vision that is blurred. It's called a scotoma. And there are many different disorders of vision. You need to understand what each of these are. Cerebral blindness means there's nothing wrong with your eyes, but there's something wrong with the brain, and that's why you can't see. And you get a very, very interesting thing called blind sight, where the person cannot see, they're blind. But if you put something in front of them and say, let's say it's a cup of tea, and you say, take your tea, they can reach for it and pick it up correctly. They can't see it through their eyes, but they can pick it up. And that's because there are two different pathways of the brain that takes in vision. The one is the one that we're more familiar with, which helps us see things. But the other one is that we're not familiar with, that the brain knows it's there, even though we can't see it the way we think of seeing. Also get a condition of denial of blindness, where somebody is blind, you know they're blind, they can't see, but they don't know it, and they deny it. Then you get different types of visual agnosias. Agnosis means not knowing. Okay? So you get visual object agnosia. You can put an object in front of them, they're completely familiar with it, well they should be, but they don't know what it is, they can't say what it is. Simultaneagnosia is if two stimuli sent at the first to the person at the same time, they'll only see the one, they won't see the other. Prosopagnosia, Greek prosopon means face, so prosopagnosia is you can't recognize faces, you can recognize everything else. And color agnosia, you can't see colors. And you also get alexia without agraphia, when the person can write, but they can't, alexia, so they can't write, but without agraphia. Alexia, they can't read, but without agraphia, so they can write. They can write, but they can't read. Okay, alexia without agraphia. And then, of course, visual hallucinations, and optic ataxia is where there's a deficit in visually guided movements. I'm going to start going a little bit faster. Okay. Parietal lobes, I'm sure you're quite familiar with them, and you know that you have sensory areas in the parietal lobes. You have your central sulcus, okay, and just behind it you have your sensory area. So all information coming from the senses goes to that area of the brain, from the right side of the body to the left, from the left side of your body to the right, and they're very specific, we call it homunculus, area that is mapped onto that brain. For example, in the corner here, as the brain, on this ridge here, before it goes down, this is where you'll find the hip, the bottom of the person, okay? And the leg, foot, and toes, and so on, go medially, whereas the rest, all of this, hands and noses and face and so on, are on the side over here. And you'll see from this picture that the brain devotes a lot of attention to the hands, to the face, and to the lips and tongue. Okay. Now, parietal lobe lesions, you get astereognosis, which you'll read about, not knowing what you're touching, blind touch, asomatognosia is not being aware of your body, anosognosia is not knowing that there's something wrong with you, like you're blind and you don't know it, or you're paralyzed and you don't know it. It's anosognosia. Autopagnosia is not knowing, you can't name or localize your body parts. So you see your leg, but it doesn't feel like it's part of you, and you can't name it, and you can't quite figure out how it fits in with the rest of your body. Fingeragnosia, not being able to name your fingers. And what often happens is that particularly if there's damage in the right parietal lobe, is you'll have contralateral neglect, where there's neglect of the left side of the body. So, and that including the left visual field. So people with contralateral neglect will sit and eat a plate of food, and they'll only eat the right-hand side. Then somebody has to come and turn the plate for them, and then they'll see the rest of the food and they'll eat it. They can see it, but they don't pay any attention to it. And then apraxia is not being able to carry out a certain action, like pouring water for yourself. You get topographical agnosia, not knowing places. Spatial acalculia, not being able to do mental arithmetic. Okay, so I just want to go back there. Now, all of these things you'll find beautifully described in Kolb-Wishall. Okay, I'm just mentioning very briefly. All right, the temporal lobes are very important. We have the three different gyri, and generally the important functions are auditory processing, which stands quite close to the ear, memory, because the hippocampus that is deep within the temporal lobe, and emotion, because the amygdala that is deep within the temporal lobe. This is just a little picture to explain auditory processing. I'm not going to go through this. You can look at it at the slide later. I want to touch quickly on memory. Your most important part of memory, of explicit memory, is your hippocampus, which sits over here, and it's on the inside of the temporal lobe. And there's one on each side. The other thing I remember when I started studying neuropsychology, when you're looking at these flat pictures of the brain, you don't always know, is there just one of this, or is there one on the other side as well? Is this in the middle of the brain, or are there two? So just so that you know, there's a hypothalamus on either side. Here's another picture of it. Here's the hypothalamus with the amygdala more or less there. You'll see almost every picture will put the amygdala in a slightly different place. And that's because it's very difficult to draw the amygdala. And there seems to be a bit of disagreement by the scientists about exactly what it looks like and where it fits in with the hippocampus. Temporal lobe lesions include auditory hallucinations, disorders of music perception, disorders of categorization, like cat, door, window, mouse, penguin, roof, amnesia, not remembering, and then temporal lobe epilepsy. With the person who has temporal lobe epilepsy, one of the things they also have is a stickiness, like a sticky personality. You can't quite, they just keep talking and talking and talking. You can't seem to, they don't get the hint that it's time for them to go now. Frontal lobes are very, very important, and there are some very important sub-areas of the frontal lobes. You get your primary motor area. So and you get your premotor area. In the premotor area, the part of the brain that is responsible for having an intention to do something, that takes place in the premotor area. And then it goes on to the motor area that actually sends out the signals to the different muscles to move. Your frontal eye fields have to do with saccadic eye movements. Now, saccadic eye movements are if something catches your attention here, you'll move your head and you'll move your eyes towards it, and that is saccadic eye movement. Also, if you're reading, you automatically, your eyes are moving, but your head's also moving, and it's because of those frontal eye fields. And of course, you know Broca's area, which is language. I just want to say also now the prefrontal cortex is this area, and the prefrontal cortex itself is extremely important, and it itself is divided into three important areas: the dorsolateral, the medial, and the orbitofrontal. Now, while I keep saying Kolben Wishaw is the best book to start reading, and it really is, and it illustrates the anatomy so well, but when it comes to understanding the functions of the prefrontal cortex, I'm going to refer you to Lizak. She explains them the best, and explains why you should be testing certain aspects of it. So, with the prefrontal cortex, you get the dorsolateral, dorsal top, lateral on the side. So it's this top part over here. Orbitofrontal is also the front, but it's just above the orbits. Okay, so if you're looking at my brain model here, dorsolateral will be at the side here. Orbital frontal is this part at the bottom here, just above the eyes. Okay. And then you get your medial prefrontal, or your ventromedial, which is between, if you had to pull the two lobes apart, it's that medial, that inner side. The motor area, as with the sensory area of the brain, okay, remember you've got your central sulcus, you've got your sensory area on the parietal side, you have your motor area just in front of it on the frontal lobe side, and it also has a homunculus, which is the same type of thing as, same areas as the sensory. So again, your hip or your bottom is at that peak over there, knees, ankles, toes, and so going down there. Large emphasis on hands, faces, lips, and so on. Now, frontal lobe lesions can lead to disturbance of motor function if the damage is in the motor area, loss of divergent thinking, environmental control of behavior. By what I mean by that is we, as we monitor our environment, we are constantly thinking about how we behave within that environment. So when you walk into a library and everybody's quiet, you're quiet. If you walk into a music concert, everybody's shouting and so on, you're going to be a bit louder. Okay, we judge our behavior by our environment, and that's as a result of our frontal lobe functioning. Poor temporal lobe memory, impaired social behavior. Poor temporal memory. What I mean by that is it's actually got nothing to do with the temporal lobes. It's really remembering what came first and what came later. Impaired social behavior, altered sexual behavior, impaired olfactory discrimination. I mean, you can imagine now those little olfactory bulbs are right there by the frontal lobe. Confabulation, where people make up stories because they don't actually know what the answer is, and they don't even realize that they're confabulating. Okay, now that was a big mouthful, and I'm going to pause for a moment because Paul also just needs to come and Paul, now's probably a good time just to come and save that, and I'm happy to take some questions while we wait for that. Were you all stunned to silence? I know this is really flying through it, but you will see as you go through the textbook, it's going to make a lot of sense to you, a lot of things to remember. But again, also think about those, printing out those Latin and Greek roots to the words, because it will really help you to understand what seems like really big terms, but they're not actually such big terms. All right, now we've looked at the cortex and all the details. Now we're going to go to the subcortical structures. These are the areas that we're normally not all that familiar with. Let's look at the ventricles. Now the ventricles are empty spaces. They're empty spaces within the brain. There are two lateral ventricles, one on each side, and then they flow together to make the third ventricle. Here's the third ventricle. And then they flow down this little tube, which is the aqueduct of the midbrain, down to this space here, which is the fourth ventricle. And then it flows down to the rest of the spinal cord. And inside of the ventricles, you have cerebrospinal fluid. Inside each ventricle, you have a little layer of like a fibrous structure that makes cerebrospinal fluid. And around about here, there's an opening where the cerebrospinal fluid then flows out and around the brain. And it flows in between the brain cells. So your brain is actually floating in cerebrospinal fluid because the brain is very, very soft. If you had to push your finger into it, it would be like jelly. Okay? It will offer very little resistance. It floats in the cerebrospinal fluid. And there's new cerebrospinal fluid being made all the time. But do you remember last time I spoke about the sinuses in the dura? Runs along there. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid flows eventually into there, and then it gets taken away along with blood and it's taken out of your central nervous system. Now, this cerebrospinal fluid is very important because the brain needs it. It carries nutrients and so on, and it's for the structure of the brain to support it. But you can just imagine if any of these little tubes are blocked and the choroid plexus is still busy making cerebrospinal fluid, these areas, these ventricles, are going to start filling up and filling, and they're going to start putting pressure on the brain cells around it. And that is what we call hydrocephalus. Okay. So this little picture of a child with hydrocephalus. Children's skulls, as you know, well, if you don't know, you will soon know, they haven't fused yet. So if the brain expands because of pressure from hydrocephalus, the skull also moves out. And it's fairly easy to fix, if one can use the word fix, because they put a shunt in, drain the fluid, sort out the blockage, everything shrinks back again, everything's fine. Okay. Where it's a problem is where you're an adult and your skull can't move. And your brain then expands, and, well, not the brain expands, the ventricles expand, and then push your brain up against the skull, and then starts damaging those neurons. And that's when hydrocephalus becomes extremely dangerous, and the doctors very quickly need to put a shunt in to drain it, and again, figure out where the blockage is so they can unblock it, and the cerebrospinal fluid can flow as normal. On an MRI scan, this is now a slice, axial slice through like this, okay? Oh, not like this, okay? Axial slice like this. And here are your ventricles, one on the left, one on the right. And those are normal, the normal size of ventricles. You can see they're actually quite big. They take up quite a lot of space in the brain. But this is a hydrocephalus brain. You can look how big those ventricles can swell. And of course, it would be putting this pressure around on the brain tissue all around it. Mm. Yes. Mm. Normal pressure hydrocephalus is when there is, the ventricles are bigger, like this, but there's no pressure in the brain. So it hasn't been a blockage, that cerebrospinal fluid isn't pooling up and putting pressure on the brain. But those ventricles are enlarged, and if it's normal pressure hydrocephalus, it's because there's been atrophy of the brain, and therefore there's more space. The brain cells have died, there's been atrophy, there's more space, and then the fluid fills that space. So it's not dangerous to the brain, the fluid itself is not putting pressure on the brain. That's normal pressure hydrocephalus. Of course, it's important to find out why the brain has been atrophying. That becomes very important. Now the hypothalamus is a little part. Hypo means under, so it's under the thalamus. You can't see the thalamus in this picture, but it's about there. And it's this part just under the thalamus. And it's not a structure in itself as much as it is a space made of lots of nuclei, and those nuclei are responsible for the maintaining our sort of physical equilibrium, temperature. It has to do with our hormones. It regulates our bodies. And the hypothalamus forms the inferior and the lateral walls of the third ventricle. So you have the third ventricle, and I want to show you in the next picture. Okay. I'll show you that in a moment. Let me just say, okay, these are the thalami. Okay, again, there's a thalamus, one on each side. Thalamus is about the size of an egg, also quite big. Thalamus, okay, so that's the thalamus, and then the hypothalamus is just under it over there. And to show you a different picture, okay, here's the pituitary gland. We're gonna deal with that more in a moment. The optic chiasm. This is the wall of the third ventricle. And on the other side of this wall, you'll find the thalamus. Okay. And the hypothalamus is in this space over here. But I think the most important thing about the hypothalamus, firstly, you need to understand what its function is, but you also need to understand it's not a structure in itself. It's rather a space with lots of nuclei in it. Here's another picture. Okay, here's your pituitary gland. This is your third ventricle over here. Okay, and then your hypothalamus, sort of this layer, this area around it. Take your time and look at these pictures more carefully when you have some more time. Now, the function of the hypothalamus, it links the nervous system to the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. Now, there are two words for pituitary gland. It's pituitary gland and hypophysis. Okay, so if you read about hypophysis, it is the pituitary gland. Okay. And it's responsible for certain metabolic processes and other activities of the autonomic nervous system. It synthesizes and secretes certain neurohormones, and these in turn stimulate or inhibit the secretion of pituitary hormones. And it controls body temperature, hunger, important aspects of parenting and attachment behaviors, thirst, fatigue, sleep, and circadian cycles. Now, we very seldom have patients with this sort of problem, but I had a patient once who had the tiniest little brain insult, and part of it was in the hypothalamus, and she was having problems with her appetite. She was having problems with, she'd get hot flushes, and it was because of damage to the hypothalamus. Now, the pituitary gland, as I said, is also called the hypophysis. I'm not going to go into it now, but it has to do with our hormones, the secretion of hormones. To do with growth, blood pressure, some aspects of pregnancy and childbirth, including stimulation of uterine contraction during childbirth, breast milk production, sex organ functions in males and females, thyroid gland function, the conversion of food into energy, in other words, metabolism, water regulation in the body, and temperature regulation, and pain relief. Okay. This little diagram I've just put in, it is just to help you learn what it does. Okay. Now, the thalamus, here I'll show this picture again. Remember, there's one on the left, one on the right. It's about the size of an egg. And there's a little interthalamic adhesion, this little bridge between the one thalamus and the other. And it is a relay station for almost all neurons. So almost all little neural pathways go through the thalamus at some point. And it relays it to and from the cortex to the rest of the body. I'm not going to say too much about that now. Just the interthalamic adhesion. Remember our picture with the hypothalamus here? This little thing here, this is the interthalamic adhesion. So you've got one thalamus, another thalamus. The little bridge between the two is the interthalamic adhesion. And in that space around it is your third ventricle. So that is why when you look at a picture like this, this is the space of the third ventricle. This is the interthalamic adhesion. And just behind that is the one thalamus. And in this picture, the other thalamus has been left out so that you can see the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is made of many different nuclei, and each nuclei projects to a different area of the brain. And here's a picture of the different nuclei and where they project to. So for example, the medial dorsal nucleus sends messages to the frontal lobes over here. And you can have a look at that in more detail when you've got a moment. The basal ganglia, as I said, from a visual, like a 3D point of view, is actually quite difficult to understand. And if you look at pictures, often pictures look slightly different. So the basal ganglia, if you had to take a coronal section where you slice through on this side, this, the globus pallidus, and the putamen, and the caudate nucleus are all part of the globus pallidus. And the reason I put this picture in here is because I think it illustrates it a little bit better. The globus pallidus, it starts off with the putamen, the basal ganglia. Let me start again. The basal ganglia starts off with the putamen, and then it has this caudate nucleus that comes out from it and moves further laterally. Okay. So this part coming around here actually moves further away from the inner side of the brain. And you can see this has been cut open here. This section here, the globus pallidus, is there. The globus pallidus, two sections there. Okay? And here's the caudate nucleus coming through there. One that side, one that side. Okay. The putamen is this sort of outer part here. There's the putamen over there. Okay, I'm hoping that's going to illustrate it for you. A little bit later, we're going to look at this brain app that will just illustrate it a little bit better. Now, it has important connections to the motor cortex, and to parts of the frontal lobe. And I'm sure you probably know that people who suffer from Parkinson's disease, it's because they have problems with the basal ganglia, because it has to do with motor functioning. So you get movement disorders like chorea, like Huntington's chorea, and you can be learning quite a lot about that. Tremors, like in Parkinson's disease. Starting and altering activities. So, for example, a person with Parkinson's, once they start walking, first it's difficult to get them to start walking. Once they start, it's difficult to get them to stop. So they'll often just shuffle forward until they hit an obstacle, and then they'll stop, because that part of the basal ganglia that initiates and stops activity isn't functioning properly. It's also involved in neuropsychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, OCD, depression, Tourette syndrome, autism, and ADD. Okay. All right, so let's look at the hippocampus. Now, as I've said already, if you think hippocampus, think memory. If you think amygdala, think emotion. If you think basal ganglia, think movement. Okay. Now, you get different types of memory, and I'm not going to go into all of this because the different types of memory are explained very well in Kolben-Wishaw. But the disorders of memory include amnesia, Korsakoff syndrome. You know Korsakoff's, where if a person's been drinking excessively and then they also haven't been eating properly, they sometimes get Korsakoff syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementias. Now, the amygdala, again, as I said, if you look at different pictures of the amygdala, they'll be drawn in slightly different ways. What you can know is it's right there next to the hippocampus. Okay, and there are strong connections between the amygdala and the hippocampus, and that is why memories have such a strong emotional component. And the more the emotional component, the better we remember it. And of course, this can also malfunction. So, for example, if you're in a terrible accident that is extremely traumatic, it's going to be so imprinted on your brain that you're going to have post-traumatic stress disorder and flashbacks and things like that, because it's almost you've remembered it almost too well. And then you'll also often find with Alzheimer's patients where the hippocampus has almost been completely annihilated. They are going to remember emotional things much more clearly. So they're going to remember that the grandchild they love came to visit them, but they won't remember what they had for breakfast that day. And also in terms of helping people with Alzheimer's, if you can also remind their families that if there's something with a strong emotional component, they'll remember it better. It can also help them help the patient. I'm not going to go through too much of the brain stem. You should know quite a bit about it already. You know the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain. Okay, and The brainstem then goes down to the spinal cord. The spinal cord comes to about the bottom of your rib cage. It doesn't go right to the bottom of where the vertebrae go. Okay. And those axons, neurons, connect straight up into the brain. They do relay here and there. I want to just go into this picture quickly, because sometimes, like in Lizak, she'll talk about the telencephalon and diencephalon and the mesencephalon, whereas we know about the pons in the midbrain and I want to explain to you how the two of them are connected, so that when you read about the telencephalon or the diencephalon in Lizak, you know exactly what she's talking about. Now, when the nervous system starts from babyhood, well, from conception, you have these sections. You have the telencephalon with the diencephalon, then the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, the myelencephalon, the rhomencephalon, and the spinal cord. And they develop into, the telencephalon develops into the cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon into the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And Lizak in particular refers to the diencephalon quite often. So no, she's talking about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Mesencephalon, the midbrain, metencephalon, the pons in the midbrain, and the myelencephalon, the medulla oblongata. And then the rhomencephalon is the medulla and the pons and the cerebellum all together. I know this sounds terribly confusing, okay? But if you look at the next slide, I'll put this picture in for you so that it can just help you to remember it more clearly. So here's a little central nervous system just starting off, okay? Here's your telencephalon. And if you follow this yellow part, you'll see how it develops and becomes the cerebral hemispheres. If you take, for example, this little pink part, it develops, it becomes a cerebellum. Okay, it helps you just keep track of how these things develop. The medulla oblongata, it's responsible for various things like respiration, blood pressure, heartbeat, swallowing, gagging, control of drooling. And if the medulla oblongata gets injured, you either die or you have profound disability, because it is so central to those things that keep us alive, like respiration. Your pons has major pathways between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. So when you think about what the cerebellum does, remember that the pons is very much involved in conveying those messages through to the cortex and vice versa. And along with the cerebellum, it correlates postural and kinesthetic or muscle movement information. And when things go wrong there, you have motor, sensory, and coordination disorders, alterations in consciousness. Okay, so often if a person has been in a very bad accident or something like that, and the brain stem is damaged, that is when they lose consciousness. A person can remain conscious. Let's say they're wide awake, unconscious, and you open up their skull and you mush around their brain a little bit, the cortex, they're not going to lose consciousness, because they lose consciousness when there's damage in the brain stem. And of course, it's very easy to get damage in the brain stem, particularly with something like a car accident where you have that acceleration and deceleration force, that brain stem gets damaged. Within the brain stem, you have the reticular activating system, or the reticular formation. And it controls your wakefulness and how alert you are and how sleepy you are, and again, your levels of consciousness. Your cerebellum, it has connections with the vestibular system, with the hypothalamus, with the spinal cord, with the motor cortex. It goes through the thalamus to the cortical areas. And the cerebellum is, I think, one of those areas that I think we're still going to be doing a lot of research on. Because if you look at how big the cerebellum is in relation to the entire brain, it's massive. But we know very little about it. But I'm glad to say there's a lot of research going into understanding the cerebellum now. This is just to illustrate the various little neural pathways that connect the cerebellum and the cortex, and then down the spinal cord. If you have damage in the cerebellum, you have difficulties with fine motor problems, with coordination, with keeping your posture up, keeping your body central, that you don't lean over to one side. Dizziness, jerky eye movements, abstract reasoning problems. You see how that abstract reasoning, now, remember I said the cerebellum is very strongly, there are strong tracts between the cerebellum and the frontal lobe. So you can see abstract reasoning problems come in there if you have cerebellar problems. Verbal fluency, which you always associate with the frontal lobe function. It is a frontal lobe function, but it involves the cerebellum. Visuospatial abilities, attention. Again, attention we always associate with frontal lobes, but think about the cerebellum as well. Memory, emotional modulation, planning and judgment, processing speed. And then it's running through the limbic system. The limbic system consists of the olfactory bulbs, the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus. The parahippocampal gyrus is a gyrus just under and around the hippocampus. The cingulate gyrus, you know the cingulate gyrus again, is this little gyrus running above the corpus callosum. The mammillary bodies, these little thingies here. The amygdala, when you think amygdala, think emotion. The fornix, which is the little track running along there. And the functions are emotion, behavior, motivation, long-term memory, olfaction. Sorry. And if you, the limbic system is even considered to be a different lobe of the brain. So like you get the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, temporal lobe, you also get a limbic lobe. It's just that the limbic system isn't made up of one area, it's made up of several different structures. But altogether it's called the limbic lobe. And when something goes wrong with the limbic system, that's when we get things like firstly Korsakoff syndrome, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, phobias, panic attacks, are psychiatric sort of problems. All right. So just to bear in mind, when you're going through all of this work, think, where is this part? What is above it, on the sides of it, below it, behind it? What is it connected to? Is there a different name for it? As you can see, there are certain structures that have more than one name. It's just to make your life exciting. It's just, you know, you don't have enough to remember and learn and so on. So they just add some extra names in for it, okay? What does it do? And what happens if it malfunctions? And again, how can I test that? How can I know that it's this part that has malfunctioned? Okay. Here's your very lengthy reading list for this coming month. Okay. I'm sorry that I can't slow you down right now. Thankfully, I think a lot of us as psychologists already have some of this knowledge. We know about the lobes of the brain. We know some of the basic functions of the brain. I do think, you know, when one studies neuropsychology, it goes into a lot more depth. But it is extremely interesting. So if it takes you a while to get to grips with it, don't lose heart. There is, every night, you'll see as we go along, as you learn about the different pathologies and so on, you will constantly be reminded of the anatomy. And do yourself a favor and then go back and check those parts of the books again that deal with that anatomy, so that by the time you're prepared for the tutorials, you'll know that anatomy backwards, or almost. Okay, all right. This app has been one of the most amazing things that I've ever encountered. It is called Visible Body, and if you Google Visible Body, or you look for it on your amongst the apps, you'll come across this. And this particular one is the brain and nervous system. Now, it gives you very different options, and I want to just go to the one that I think might be most helpful at the moment. Okay, you can see the brain, right? Now, what is nice about this is you can firstly rotate it, all right? You can see what is there immediately at the back. And remember that the spinal cord, you know, we often see a picture of the brain, you see it cut off by the brain stem. Remember it goes all the way down, okay, to the spinal cord. But look at what is nice about this app. you can choose a part. Sorry, let's go back. And you can take it away. All right. What you're looking at there, that blue part, is, well, the mesencephalon. It's part of the brain stem. Okay, so let's take that away. Now, you can see the internal structures a bit better. Okay. Oh, yeah. This part over here, that is the putamen, part of the basal ganglia. Remember the putamen? So let's make that go away. Now that part is a globus pallidus, also part of the basal ganglia. Let's take that away. There's your globus pallidus, the medial aspect of it. Let's take that away. There's your thalamus. Okay. Now let's have a closer look at the thalamus. I'm going to shrink it a bit again. If I rotate it, look at where that thalamus fits in. Do you see that third ventricle? Okay, this blue thalamus now is the left thalamus. You can see that third ventricle, that liquid just to the right of that is the third ventricle. You can see where it fits in the brain. Okay. That's your hippocampus. So you can see where that fits in. All right. Let's take the thalamus away. I want to show you a structure that's maybe more. Okay, I'm looking at all these things that you. Okay, there's a corpus callosum. See where it is in relation to everything else. Okay. Now, I want to highly recommend that you get yourself this app, and as you're studying each little brain part, highlight it on it, take away everything else around it, or add it on, so that you can see exactly where it is in relation to everything else. Unfortunately, one does need to pay for it. It's a few hundred rand. It's about 300 rand. But I can really highly recommend this. I want to just show you something else. Here's your limbic system. You remember I said the limbic system, they also refer to as the limbic lobe. If you look at it like this, it's easier to understand. You know, you can look at the different labels. You've got your cingulate gyrus, your hippocampus. Now look here. I want to show you something. Look where they have the amygdala. Let's see, that's why I say every picture you look at, the amygdala is in a slightly different place. But there's your fornix. Septal nucleus you don't really need to worry about. Okay. But that is your limbic lobe, your limbic system. And when you're studying the limbic system again, I recommend that you have a look at this. Okay. All right, you're welcome to come and play with this. It's called a visible body. Visible body. And you get different parts of it. For example, you get the skull, you get the arms, the legs, the abdomen. But look at the nervous system, brain and the nervous system, and you'll get to this.